Ottomans were in Shanghai. Are you familiar with that family? Maybe
Yeah, not very. They haven't been very involved in the
No.
synagogue.
but she's
but,
yeah.
But yes, I know he had was it a tech
Oh.
store, right?
Well, his son is running it now. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's called Sound of Music.
Uh-huh.
Oh,
And yeah, Steve is still running it as far as I know.
Well, there were 18,000 people.
Is that right?
I
Right.
wish I had known that when we were there. You know, we were on a tour, didn't know anything about it. And now I want to go back.
Yeah. And as a matter of fact, as I think I've mentioned before, I'll mention again, there is a Jewish tour of
Oh,
Hong
really?
He takes you through the community there in Hong Kong.
Ni hao.
And ni hao, right?
Yeah,
Well, Mel,
fascinating. This
I'm
book
glad
is
you helped.
absolutely,
Mel, I'm glad you
this
helped me
book is so
integrate.
fascinating. It reads like a novel. So you just want to keep reading. It's a good book.
So I will urge everyone to now go to, it's called Harbor of the Holocaust or Harbor in the Holocaust. It's a PBS.
Yes, I have it recorded, but I haven't seen it yet.
It's a PBS program.
Yeah.
It was a PBS. And I think what I saw, I looked at it again last night. I'd seen it once before. What I saw was an abbreviated version, which was about 45 minutes, and then a discussion afterwards. But several of the people who are mentioned in our book, including our author, are part of that program.
Good, we'll have to watch.
What's the name of it?
Harbor of the Holocaust or Harbor in the Holocaust?
And
It was on a couple weeks ago.
it's a PBS program.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a PBS program, but you can get it right online.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, evidently there was a woman who ran who created this Jewish tour, and when she retired, an Israeli fellow took over, and he's been doing these tours ever since. He has an interesting hobby, and that is, of course, there have been over the years Jews who have died in Shanghai. And so there were, I think, more than one Jewish cemetery. But those cemeteries, I think, do not exist anymore in Shanghai. In Harbin, there is a Jewish cemetery. We'll talk about Harbin a little later. But what they did, now we know this story from Jerusalem as well, but Jerusalem is not a pretty story. They used the tombstones from the Jewish cemetery for walkways and other kinds of things.
Oh.
And this fellow, this Israeli fellow, when people call him and let him know that they found a tombstone, and he collects them. So
what did they build over the ground where the?
Exactly. I'm not sure, but they used the tombstones.
Yeah.
Because they were flat. They were flat stones, and they used them for other purposes.
Well, you mentioned Israel. Before we begin, do you want to have a commentary on the latest?
Oh, what about it?
Yeah, well, I think there's good and maybe. The good is, I think it's time for Israel to have a new prime minister.
Yes. Who may go
That's
to
the good.
jail. Yes.
The
Bad is
maybe-
he's
the
more of
maybe
a hawk.
The maybe is how are these people going to function? They don't agree on anything. This new coalition. So maybe they'll focus on the economy. Maybe they will focus on certain other issues, but they're not. There's going to be no change in policy having to do with Palestinians. No change in terms of the settlements. No change in terms of in terms of progress toward some sort of negotiated peace. Certainly, no progress toward a two-state solution.
He doesn't believe in it, he says.
Right, he doesn't. He's a very attractive guy. When I was in Israel 3 or 4 years ago, for a rabbinical assembly convention, he spoke to us in the Knesset. I was not a fan of his then, but I can tell you that he's, to say smooth,
Charismatic.
he's charismatic, yeah, maybe. He's an interesting, like Netanyahu, he speaks English without an accent.
Wow.
And that's because his parents were Americans. I think his parents lived in San Francisco before they made Aliyah. So obviously when he was growing up, and he had some of his education here in the United States too. So he speaks without any accent, which is certainly a plus in terms of diplomacy. But he is certainly, perhaps, the newspapers are saying, more right-wing than Netanyahu.
That's scary.
Well,
Don't forget that Begin is the one who made peace with Sadat.
that's true.
And Begin is the one who was so far to the right and extreme, and everybody thought it was going to be the moderate party. And then Begin came in, and then there was peace with Egypt, which started the whole ball rolling. So you never know. It could
Remember
be stopped by that person that could do it.
Begin was the student of Zev Jabotinsky.
Right.
And my favorite line, my line from Zev Jabotinsky is, to get his philosophy, the Jordan River is not a physical feature that runs along the border of Israel, but runs through its middle. So understand that. That was, real Palestine, the real. Remember that the ancient Palestine into the modern era included the country of Jordan.
Yes.
And it was the British who chopped off a piece of the land east of the Jordan River because they had a problem. The problem was they had two families, two clans, both of whom claimed direct descendants from Muhammad, and the British gave the family of Saud, they gave them the kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the kingdom of Hussein was from the
Hashemite. The Hashemite kingdom.
Right, the Hashemite kingdom. They gave them Jordan. So when we talk about the division of Palestine into the UN division of Palestine into a Jewish and Palestinian state, we're not talking about all of Palestine. We're talking about only Palestine that's west of the Jordan River, that was supposed to become a Jewish state and an Arab state. The Jewish state, of course, becomes Israel. The Arab state never comes into being because as a result of the war in 1948, Jordan takes over the majority of the piece, which we call the West Bank, that was supposed to become the country of Palestine that never came to being. So what's going to happen? It's going to be very interesting because he actually won 7 seats. but one of the people that from his party chose not to join the coalition. So he's only has 6 seats in which now he has another 55 coalition partners, including for the first time an Arab party.
That's right.
Is there any reason the Knesset won't okay this since they have to vote on it?
Yeah, I can't imagine why they would. If you have they don't want to go to another election. That they certainly don't want to do. But who knows how long this coalition remains together? I mean, they have to really be very careful because they may fall apart as well.
As my son-in-law says, the coalition only has one purpose: to throw Bibi out.
That's right.
I think that's true.
That's right.
So
Interesting thing, by the way,
For a beard.
looking into Bennett's history, his parents were Reformed. Members of
No, we didn't.
Temple Emmanuel in San Francisco, which was classic Reform.
yeah, I don't know if his parents are still alive.
I
But
don't know whether they are.
they made Aliyah, and he was born in Israel, so he's native born. But
They made Aliyah after the 6-Day War, and they moved back and forth in and out of Israel for business purposes. Bennett himself, Naftali, came under the influence of the Chabad. That's how he became right wing.
oh, that I didn't know.
Yeah, right. San Francisco Chabad.
San Francisco Chabad.
That sounds like a
I could have.
kind of contradiction in terms, doesn't it?
Oh, no.
Busy.
Oh,
It's
no.
a
I
big
could have
one.
become a good friend of the prime minister. You know,
Right.
well, or at least the parents of the prime minister.
Yeah.
So good morning, everyone. So
Morning.
today we are really going to get our author, Jonathan Kaufman's telling of the story of the refugees who arrived in Shanghai, and the process of their arrival, and actually their survival. It appears that although there were deaths along the way, there were some elderly people who died there in Shanghai. There's a tradition in the Torah that 603,220, I think, Israelites left Egypt, and the same number entered the Promised Land when they. So how is that possible? Well, the same number of, according to tradition, the same number of deaths, the same number of births. So in Shanghai, there were births, and evidently there were about 18,000 Jews who came to Shanghai, and at the end of the war, there were 18,000 Jews. So that was that's pretty amazing.
But why Shanghai so dark, so foreign to the West?
Well, Shanghai was first of all, we had Ho Feng Shen, who we'll talk about in a minute. But Shanghai was one of the only places that was called an open city. You did not need a visa to get in. Aside from which, Elaine, your question is an important one. In 1938, one of the things he mentions in the story, 1938, there was a gathering in Evian, an Evian conference in which 31 or 32 countries participated. The agenda for the Evian conference was, who's going to take Jews? It's 1938. Hitler has already invaded Vienna, I think, Austria. This may have been, I don't know whether the Evian conference was just before or just after Kristallnacht, but they knew the Jews were in trouble. So they called a conference together to figure out what we can do with Jewish refugees. And what happened?
Nobody wanted the Jews.
Only 32 countries. Only 31 said we don't want any Jews. One country said they would take 100,000 Jews. What country was that?
China?
The Dominican Republic.
Right.
The Dominican Republic said they would take 100,000 Jews. So we have to remember that two of the biggest bastards in the world were two of the most important heroes in terms of Jewish survival. One was Trujillo in the Dominican Republic, and the other was Batista in Cuba.
Right.
These were two disgustingly horrible human beings, but for their own reasons, they allowed Jews to come into their country because, you know, Jews had this reputation of being businessmen, of currying favor with certain countries, certain connections. And for that reason, both the Dominican Republic and Cuba, I don't know that Cuba was at Evian, but Cuba also allowed Jews in. So we know a number. I have family actually that went to Cuba, and it was through Cuba that they came into the United States. But let's start. So that's why you asked the question, Elaine. You asked the question, why Shanghai? Because Jews were desperate to go any place, and no place would let them in. The United States had in the 1920s. In 1920s, the Jews, America closed its borders. You know, between 1880, 1875, and 1920, 2.5 million Eastern European Jews came to the United States. Almost the vast majority of American Jews were part of that immigration from 1875. Raise your hand if your family came here between those years.
Susan Axel's hand up.
Okay. Yep.
It's
So,
definitely ours.
right. Before, just quickly, it's not our subject. Before 1870, there were a total of 100,000 Jews in the United States. Between 1875 and 1915, 2.5 million Jews arrived. So you have to understand what was, and then in the 20s, we have a same policy that we had over with Mr. Trump. No immigrants. Certainly, we want immigrants maybe from Denmark or from Norway, but we don't want the Irish, we don't want the Italians, we don't want Jews, and we don't want we don't want these misfits that are coming. So in the 1920s, the American borders were basically closed, and there were quotas from every single country. How many people from Germany could come into the United States? How many people from Austria could come into the United States? It was a relatively low number. That was so America was closed, and almost the whole rest of the world did not want to be flooded by Jews. So which brings us to Ho Feng Shen. Somebody want to tell us about Mr. Ho? Anybody?
Wasn't he in Austria and gave visas to the Austrian Jews?
Yes. He was he came from Jonathan Kaufman gives us a very nice biography of this fellow who comes. He doesn't come from a particularly from nobility or anything in China. He has, and he's sent various places, and finally he's part of the diplomatic corps. And he sent to Vienna, I think in 1937. He's horrified by what he sees. He gives lectures about China, and he becomes friendly with certain Jews. In particular, is mentioned two Jewish women who he says that he would protect, and against the ambassador's will, the ambassador, I think, is in Berlin, by the way. Against the ambassadors, he starts writing visas. Now, you don't need a visa to get into Shanghai, but you do need a visa to get out of Germany and Austria. So these were visas which were functioning as exit visas. But okay, now you get out of the country. Now where do you go? I mean, you can go to Shanghai, but where else? Carol tells the story that she has an uncle that jumped ship and illegally entered Canada and then illegally entered the United States. But how do you jump ship and go anyplace else? So some people took those exit visas and went someplace else if they could. Some went to Shanghai and then found their way to either Hong Kong or Australia. He was recalled in May 1940 back to China. So between 1937 and 1940, we don't know how many, but wait a minute. No, by June of 1938, he had already written 1,906 visas. Now this was dangerous for him to do, so as we talk about heroes, this Mr. Ho is a hero. I mentioned earlier that I watched last night a 45-minute PBS video called Harbor in the Holocaust, Harbor of the Holocaust. And I urge you to see it. It's a PBS YouTube, and Jonathan Kaufman is mentioned, is quoted there, and Mr. Ho's daughter is quoted on the. So certain things that we read about in these last two chapters are documented in this PBS piece. So I recommend it to you. Strongly. Mr. Ho evidently dies in 1999, I think, in San Francisco. He was part of the nationalist regime. He left with the nationalists for Taiwan in the revolution. And he was if you look at look up his name on Wikipedia, it's very interesting. He was refused a pension over some stupid, crazy stuff, which evidently was not unusual. His daughter in that show says that he basically did not talk about what he did after the war, and she dug up some of the documentation of his life, so we have to assume that he was responsible for saving thousands, if not perhaps tens of thousands of Jews. Not a household name, but very important. Yes, he was. So by June of 1938, he had written almost 2,000 visas, and he was in Vienna until May of 1940. So he was continuing to write visas even after that. The name Jacob Schiff comes up. Who's Jacob Schiff?
He
You
was
want to
an
tell us about Jacob
American,
Schiff?
yeah, he was an American philanthropist.
America. Well, he was somebody who made a lot of money. He worked on Wall Street
Well,
for one of the very big Wall Street Jewish firms. Made a lot of money. And what's his role in our chapter? Anybody remember? It's sort of the beginning of chapter 6. What was his role? 1905 was the Russo-Japanese War. The Japanese needed money. No one was going to give them money. Jacob Schiff gave them.
Arrange for loans.
Wait a minute. He arranged for loans of. I have it here. Wait a minute. Where's Carol? Please. He gave them loans of $200 million, which would today be worth $33 billion. He loaned to the Japanese. That's a lot of power to be able to loan what's today would be $33 billion to the Japanese. Why was he interested in the Japanese?
He was
Interested in the Japanese because he knew what was happening, what the Russians were doing to Jews.
Right.
There had been the Kishinev pogrom. There had been other pogroms. And if the Japanese were going to go fight with the Russians, he was going to support the Japanese. He made it possible to fight for the Japanese. He also has two things. One is the Russo-Japanese War, in which the Japanese defeated the Russians. This was the first time an Asian country defeated a European country in a war. Carol and I took a plane up to Harbin. Harbin is almost on the Russian border. It's still in China. What's so interesting in Harbin is that, first of all, one of the Israeli prime ministers grew up in Harbin. There is a Jewish cemetery there. Almost every building in Harbin, first of all, the buildings look European. Almost every building has a plaque on it with a Jewish name. So my sense is that how did Jews get to Harbin? I guess that there were a lot of, my guess, I don't know this specifically, but my guess is there were a lot of Jewish soldiers who were part of the Russian army, who when the war was over, didn't go home. They stayed in Harbin. By the way, Harbin it's a very nice city. There's all kinds of Jewish stuff there in Harbin. You go into the major hotel and there are pictures of Jewish celebrations, etc. They're famous for their ice celebration. We were there. What month were we there?
We were there in December.
We were there in December. In December, it was cold in Beijing. It was very nice in southern China. In Harbin, it was freezing, and we were not there in the worst part of the winter.
I've been right across the river.
What's that?
I've been right across the river a couple times in Khabarovsk in December.
Cold.
Oh yeah, minus.
By the way, Jacob Schiff. Let me add another piece. I really didn't look up his whole biography, but what I know of Jacob Schiff was one of the principal financial backers of the Jewish Theological Seminary. Jacob Schiff was not a conservative Jew. He was not a traditional Jew. He probably belonged to Temple Emmanuel. So he was a committed Jew, but not an observant Jew in any way. Why did he fund the Jewish Theological Seminary, which is it's where I went to school, it's where Rabbi Stanford went to school, it's where Cantor Shivers went to school. Why would he fund the formation of the Jewish Theological Seminary? because he was watching all these immigrants, the immigrants that were coming from 1875 or so. They were coming by the truckload, shipload. They were coming, huge numbers of Jews were arriving. They would not have been comfortable at Temple Emmanuel. They were more traditional. And the issue was, how do you provide something for these people that will be meaningful for them and help to Americanize them? And so the Jewish Theological Seminary was was an answer. Elaine?
I'm saying one of the other things he did, he funded the settlement house phenomenon, in which,
Right.
again, the Jews were to be educated to be, quote, Americans.
Because it was huge, a different issue than in Shanghai, but the issue here in the United States was the terrible fear of anti-Semitism. All these Jews arriving in New York, number one, we have to get them out of New York. We have to get them to other places. So there was a huge effort to do that. And the other, we can't let them be on, it wasn't called welfare at the time.
On the dole, yeah, I think
on relief. We can't let them be on relief. We have to make them productive. How do you make them productive? Teach them English, give them a trade, provide somehow for them to be productive on their own. So as the Lower East Side filled up with Jews, and these were Jews that, the Jews who were here, that 100,000 Jews who were here before, they didn't understand these Eastern European Jews. That 100,000 Jews had already assimilated into America, and here came Jews who were peddlers, who didn't have a Western hygiene, who came in, how do we Americanize them? So Jacob Schiff not only was involved in several things, he was involved in this concern about what's going to happen to all these Jews that arrived. But our chapter talks about, at the same time that Jacob Schiff funds the Japanese, Jonathan Kaufman doesn't combine them in the same way that I am going to combine them. He talks about Japanese soldiers coming back from the Russo-Japanese War with the protocols of the Elders of Zion. So, these Japanese have no experience with Jews. All of a sudden, they come back with protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is this fraudulent text about how Jews control the world. That they have a meeting every year, and they decide how the world will, what's going to happen in the world. You wonder, how do people believe these things? I think I shared with you once before that the World Affairs Council here in Portland, it has chapters all over the world, but the World Affairs Council hosts different groups of people that come here, some to see how we deal with water, some to see how we deal with garbage, some to see how we deal with everything from bicycle lanes to who knows. And the local chapter has to host these groups of people. They're usually 4 or 5 different people, and they have to host them for a couple of days. So they have to figure out what to do with them. They enlisted Frank Efrangi and me to meet with them, because they probably have never met with Jews and Arabs, certainly Jews and Arabs who talk to each other. So one gathering we had, and Frank Efrangi couldn't come, so I met with a group of 5 or 6 people in the synagogue library, and I tried to introduce them to what it is, a little bit about Judaism and etc. And when I was finished, they asked me questions. Finally, one of the guys who was from a country in Africa, in East Africa, I don't remember exactly where, and his question to me was, when is the meeting? So he had grown up with the protocols of the elders of Zion. So he was asking me, he had this chance now. He was talking to a real Jew, a rabbi even. I should know when the meeting takes place. How do you answer that? So the only thing I could think of saying at the time was, when you find out, you let me know. Because, so the protocols of the elders of Zion is, was about Jewish power. Now, again, Kaufman doesn't connect this with Jacob Schiff, but I think there's a reason to connect the two. Obviously, if Jacob Schiff is the reason that in many ways the Japanese army gets underwritten, certainly it fits that Jews control the world. So this is, something that goes on much of the chapter deals with the Japanese and the Japanese trying to figure out who the Jews are and what they can do with them. I'm going through some of the names. You remember Hoshigi Inuzuka? Hoshigi Inuzuka?
Yes.
He was a Japanese naval captain. And what can we say about him? You're pointing finger down. Barbara, why?
He's anti-Semitic for one thing.
Yeah, isn't he the one that was so anti-Semitic and then he became in control over when the Japanese were controlling China? Isn't he the one that wasn't ultimately in control of that and wanted to do the same solution to the Jews that Germany wanted? Like he was hand in hand with Germany and wanted to implement their plan to the Jews that were hiding out in Shanghai. Is that the right guy? That's that.
Yeah, partly. He's when the Japanese begin to come into Shanghai, they deal with Victor Sassoon, and Victor he wants money from Victor, and he's now also convinced that he's a Jew. He has a lot of money. He's probably in control of the world. He's probably part of that cabal, and Victor plays it very, he plays with them. He stalls them. He does everything possible because Victor is a Brit. Victor is, and as a matter of fact, he tells Inuzuka, do not let the Japanese join with the Germans, because if the Japanese join with the Germans in the Axis, then of course the British and the Americans will join with the Russians, and that's not good. But while throughout this chapter we get sort of a mixed feeling about him, in fact, he's the one who provides protection for the Jews. Afterwards he's relocated, but in many ways he's really a hero. One of the things that in traveling to China and Japan that I do not understand is how absolutely brutal, I mean brutal, the Japanese were with the Chinese. They were absolutely terribly brutal. And although this was not, the Jews didn't live pretty, the Jews survived. And the Jews were really not murdered. They were not persecuted. They lived under horrible conditions. they were then pushed into a ghetto situation. 18,000 Jews in Hongqiu among 100,000 Chinese in the poorest section of Shanghai. But he is responsible for their protection. Why? Even when there was pressure from the Germans later, the Japanese, who knew how to be brutal, did not do what the Germans wanted them to do with the and I do not understand why.
Okay, so I read something a while ago, and we had a speaker once at the synagogue who had lived in Japan during the war, and he talked about they didn't pick on the Jews because most of them were German Jews, and Germany was an ally of Japan. So they couldn't, even though Germany wanted them to do bad things to the Jews, they didn't get it.
The guy says, I'm not a killer, go home.
Well, but I think there's probably a lot of truth to that, but it's sort of an interesting chapter. I don't know if we would call Mr. Inuzuka a real hero like Mr. Ho, but the fact that Jews survived intact is absolutely amazing.
Rabbi Isaac?
Yeah.
Who did I mix him up with? I know there was like a bad Japanese guy. I just can't keep the name straight. There was somebody who was the one who really wanted to do it, but I guess this is the guy that stopped it from doing it.
No, the other guy came in and he was the one who, rather than doing what the Germans suggested, he was the one who put them in this fenced-in area where they needed now passes to get out and get in. The next guy had no love for Jews, but he allowed the previous guarantees to hold. Madame Sun Yat-sen is mentioned, a very brief mention in our chapter. I think it was Victor who had a relationship with her, and she goes to the German consulate and she complains about treatment of Jews in Europe. Charlie Chaplin has a little mention. And you remember how Charlie Chaplin is mentioned? As Victor tries to get support, he goes and turns to the people that he knows, and he turns to Charlie Chaplin, who gives them money. As a matter of fact, I think it says that we have the reference that what's the famous Charlie Chaplin film?
Great dictator.
Was it
The Great Dictator.
Some of his profits from The Great Dictator,
Yes.
he sent for protection of the Jews. There were some people who said that they thought Charlie Chaplin was Jewish. Of course, he's not Jewish. He's not Jewish. Interesting that they mentioned several times a guy named Theodore Alexander.
Rabbi Ted Alexander.
Rabbi Ted Alexander. Phil, tell us about Rabbi Ted Alexander.
Rabbi Ted was the rabbi of the Jewish community in Shanghai. He left Shanghai with the Shanghai Jews that came to San Francisco, and he was the rabbi of congregation B'nai Emunah for 40 some odd years or more. He has since passed away, but his daughter became a conservative rabbi.
Yep. So why is he mentioned here? He was their rabbi. He came as a kid. He came as a kid and brought a Torah with him to China. He was hired. What was he? Wait a minute. I have here the notes. He was hired by Victor as a purchasing agent. Eventually, I was surprised to see his name, because although I may have known that he was in Shanghai, I mean, to pick him out of the 18,000 people, he's one of the only people of the refugees that's mentioned by name. But yes, he comes to San Francisco. He's declared a rabbi in Shanghai by rabbis who were there in Shanghai, sort of interesting. Two other people that are mentioned. One is Lucy Hartwich.
Boy, that name sounds familiar.
What's that?
That name sounds familiar.
Okay, well, Lucy Hartwich is hired by Horace Kaduri to run the Kaduri School. He set up Horace, we'll talk about them in a minute. Horace creates a school. The building is still there. It's still a central building. When you see this harbor of the Holocaust, several people will talk about the school. He mentions that at one point there were 700 students at the school. And although she was German, she taught the kids, school was taught in English. So all these refugees, it would have been much easier to teach this school in German, because all of their parents spoke German, but they were determined to teach in English. And as a matter of fact, she had been the head of a school in Europe. And so when she came to, and Hartwich, I don't know, I think she was not Jewish, but she comes to Shanghai, and Kaduri hires her to run the school. When they were persecuting certain leaders, they did not bother her because she was German. Laura Margolis. Laura Margolis is one other person that's mentioned, who comes in May of 1941, and she is sent by the JDC. People familiar with the Joint Distribution Committee? The JDC still exists today. The JDC is the Jewish International Organization. If there's any organization that controls the whole world, it would be the JDC. The JDC, whenever there is a crisis, even if there's an earthquake in Thailand, and you would like to contribute some funds, and you'd like it to be through Jewish auspices, you can do it through the JDC. They have connections really all over the world. JDC, of course, would not itself deal with the earthquake in Thailand, but they have their connections with people who do. But in particular, the JDC deals with Jewish communities. Throughout this, starting in 1937, when the first Jews start to arrive, Victor pleads with European and American Jewry, help us to fund what's going on. They're arriving so fast, we don't know what to do with them. And the American and British and European Jews are too busy with other things. They don't send anything. They're left on their own, except finally in 1941, they send Laura Margolis. Laura Margolis, interestingly, she has enormous criticisms for the Kaduris and the Sassoons. They don't know what they're doing. They messed up everything. I got to tell you, until I got to that point, I was pretty impressed with what the Sassoons and the Kaduris were doing. we were at a dinner. I think it was perhaps even a Stanford annual dinner that was done, and we were seated at the table with Arlene Schnitzer, and Arlene Schnitzer was on a really was on
She was on a tear.
on a terrible complaint, and she couldn't stop, and she was angry at all of her rich friends who don't give anything to charity. She was furious that she has all these rich friends and all they can think of is themselves. So you think about that for a minute, you know, nobody is required to give charity. Okay, you may get a tax deduction, that might be nice, but all of charity is really given out of the goodness of your hearts. Everything that we have in the Jewish community, and well beyond it, everything that we have in the Jewish community was given by all of us, whether it has to do with care for senior citizens, whether it has to do with a counseling service, whether it has to do with Jewish Film Festival, whether it has to do with camps, whether it has to do with universities, whether it has, all the things that we Jews have created in the United States, we created out of the generosity of individual Jews. We've done it here in Portland. You know, every penny that every budget that we have here in Portland. I think if you add the budgets together of the institutions, I'm not including the Robeson Home here because that's, I think, or the Roschnitzer Manor, because I think that's a whole budget unto itself. We're talking about $20 to $25 million probably that's raised every year by us to run our Jewish community.
Rabbi,
yeah.
I have a story if you want to. I
Sure.
was once on the board of Providence Hospital.
Mhm.
When they wanted to raise money for their new cancer center before it was built. And they were talking about that on the board. And I said, well, don't you have a list of Catholic donors? And they didn't know what I was talking about. And I said exactly what you said, that we in the Jewish community raise the money for A, B, and C. There was no list, and I think they were correct, of quote, Catholic donors who would give to a Catholic entity.
Hmm.
And that was, you know,
But we can take great pride in what we have done and what we continue to do in the community. So the JDC is one of those organizations that we support, and so Laura Margolis had tremendous criticism of what of the generosity of both the Sassoons and the Kaduris. So remember who we're talking about. We throughout these two chapters, the only Sassoon that we're talking about is Victor, right? Victor, and we're told early on, Victor really has no interest in things Jewish. Somehow Eli Kaduri does have interest in Jewish things, but Victor Sassoon contributes. He gives money, and there's an interesting story where, you know, they didn't get along so well together. The Sassoons, they were competitors to some degree, and I don't remember, was it Lawrence or was it Eli Kaduri that humbly comes to Victor and wants a contribution to help with these refugees, and Victor says, whatever he gave, I'll match it. I think it was $50,000 at the time. But these refugees keep coming, and they have no control or no knowledge of what to do with them. And what happens with Victor later on?
He leaves.
What happens with Victor through all of this?
He leaves.
Right. Before Kristallnacht, he didn't know Kristallnacht was coming. He leaves for India. So although Victor is not involved in the in what's going on, except that he goes around, speaks, fundraises, etc., for what's going on in China. Ellie has these two sons, Horace and Lawrence, and Lawrence is the one who's supposed to take over the business, and Lawrence is located in Hong Kong, and Horace is in Shanghai. Lawrence continuously needles, and Ellie stays with Lawrence in Hong Kong. And Lawrence always needles Horace. You really should do work. And the only thing that Horace is interested in are these Jews that are coming, and he does all kinds of interesting things. What do I have here? When Jews arrived, Eli Kaduri organizes to help. He finds rooms at boarding houses, meals. He helps them find jobs, and it's probably Eli Kaduri who deals with Madame Sun Yat-sen, not Victor. Lawrence, he does all kinds of, here it is. He creates a children's group, provides food, medicine, sports, and recreation in Hongqiu. And he's involved in recreation. He creates a camp, medical exams, toys, a hockey league, Boys and Girl Scouts, a summer camp, and the Kaduri School. All this Horace creates. Interestingly, I'm not sure how much the Jews knew that that the Kaduris in particular were doing for them. What happens with Ellie, Horace, and Lawrence in the second part of chapter 7?
Well, ultimately, Ellie and Lawrence leave Hong Kong and go to Shanghai, where they're basically incarcerated in the stable of their house. And Ellie dies. And
yeah, they think things are, Lawrence thinks that he's got his father in his hotel in the peninsula. But things are so bad in Hong Kong that he thinks that things would be better if he was able to take his father back to Shanghai. It's evidently a long journey. Somebody's phone. It's a long journey that they go back, and rather than they are released in Hong Kong, and they were really treated miserably. And in fact, without Victor and without the Kaduris, because Horace is also in prison, but separately, there's no Jewish leadership. And there's great suffering through all of this. Let's see. Where so Ellie dies. The war ends August 20th, 1945. The Japanese guards disappeared. All 18,000 Jews survive. He, by the way, is honored by Yad Vashem, belatedly, posthumously, actually. And we're told at the very end of the chapter that Victor sent back pay to all of his employees, who of course couldn't work. Any thoughts on these people? Now, having gone through this period, I mean, really, the Kaduris, they really suffered. Victor himself doesn't suffer, but they're put under enormous pressure. 18,000 people is a lot of people. And they don't come all at once. They're 100 here, 200 there. They keep coming on these boats.
But the Kaduris were the impetus to help, not the Sassoons.
Right.
They were the ones that pushed.
They were more religious. They were.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Victor provided some support, but not the same way the Kaduris did. Not the same way that certainly that Horace did. That he provided so much. In the chapter, they mention actually that Lawrence gets married in Hong Kong. He gets married. How many of you have been to Hong Kong? A lot of people have been to Hong Kong. Any of you go to the synagogue, Ohel Leah?
No.
We came to Hong Kong. Just a very quick story. We came to Hong Kong, and I had made reservations on the hill in probably the least expensive place I could find.
It was a Catholic residence.
It was a Catholic residence. And as I was checking in, there was a family that was checking out, and the kids and the father were wearing kippot. So they were from, I think, Australia, and they were on their way to Israel. So I engaged him in conversation, and he said, "Have you been to the synagogue?" Well, I knew nothing really about the Jewish community of Hong Kong. I said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "It's just down the street." So, okay. My first adventure from the hotel, I walk down the street that we're on, and there, of course, is Ohel Leah, is the synagogue that was built by the Sassoons in honor of their grandmother, I think. It's a beautiful synagogue that's been refurbished, with part of the land they sold. Part of, evidently, was on a large parcel of land. It's an Orthodox synagogue, and on the parcel of land that they sold, the person who bought it built a high rise. Of course, they're all high rises there in Hong Kong. The bottom 3 floors are owned by the Jewish community. In one floor, there's a restaurant and a museum, and there are apartments there for the Orthodox rabbi and the Reform rabbi that are there. And there is a fund that was established with the money, that all the institutions in Hong Kong receive money from this fund annually. And I think it was Chabad at one point. By the way, it's not the only synagogue. There are plenty of other synagogues. Chabad at one point opened up their own kosher restaurant. And the committee in charge of this fund turned to Chabad and said, you want to get an allocation from us? Close the restaurant. Do not provide a competition to our kosher restaurant. They closed the restaurant. So this is when you go to Hong Kong, on the hill, halfway up the hill is Ohel Leah, and I encourage you to visit there. I've visited, I think, 3 or 4 different synagogues.
But the other synagogues were in Kowloon.
The other synagogues were in Kowloon, right?
Not only
Um,
Hong Kong.
So, I think that Lawrence is not a great example of support to the Jewish community. But Horace is pretty amazing in his support. Any other thoughts about this chapter, the survival for the Jews that arrive?
It's a very interesting community because when I was living in San Francisco as my kids were growing up, a lot of our friends were children of the, pardon me, Shanghai refugees. And we got a lot of stories about how things were pretty rough.
Very hard.
My mentor, Cantor Hans Kohn, was bar mitzvah in Shanghai. His father passed away. His parents had run a restaurant in Shanghai, and he actually jumped ship, went to Australia, jumped ship again, wound up in the United States. He wasn't quite sure whether there was still a price on his head, and he eventually settled in the San Francisco area, and as I said, was my mentor in Chazanut.
So two things that I think that we should think about.
Sure.
One is, who were these Jews who came from Vienna, from Austria, from Germany? They were middle and upper middle class Jews, or upper class, wealthy Jews. And they came to absolute primitive chaos. Michael Blumenthal, do people know that name?
Yes.
Michael Blumenthal, who was Secretary of the Treasury, I think. Michael Blumenthal was one of those Jews, and in the movie that I recommended, Harbor in the Holocaust, he's quoted, and he says, "So we come to we're brought to a hotel," he said, "filled with mice and with rats, and there's no hygiene. There are no toilets, really. That there are, basically piss pots that are picked up every day." And one of the women in the movie says, they get picked up every day, and they slobber it over the side. It falls on the floor. This is. And they're crammed in such, when they are all brought into Hongqiu, they are crammed in such small facilities that disease starts to break out, all kinds of horrible diseases these people who are used to having, I know from my own grandparents. My own grandparents were not wealthy, but they, I think my mother and my uncle were nurse. They were people who took care of them in Germany. My grandmother, I think, had a cook, and had a maid. And can you imagine when these people arrive in Shanghai? It's a total shock. The other thing to think about is really what they created when they were there. They created theater. They created an orchestra. They created, all kinds of cultural events. They created newspapers. They had shops. The people invented whatever they can do. This one family that we're introduced to in the beginning that came. The father has a fruit and vegetable stand. How does he conduct the fruit and vegetable stand? He has these two kids. The two kids, he sends them every day to get permits to go outside the gate, and they go and buy the fruits and vegetables, and they bring them back, and that's what he sells. So they're inventive, they're creative, and I guess the third thing is that you see in this film a lot is how welcoming the Chinese were. Their Chinese neighbors were gracious, compassionate. They were as poor as could be, but the kids and the adults, they made friends, and they lifelong friends that they kept. I think some of that's really amazing. Number one, their ability to survive in these horrible conditions, and thrive, and make it out the other. They had no idea how long this would last. No idea how long they would be in these horrible conditions. But they did the best they could. All right, ladies and gentlemen, next two chapters. What is that?
8 and 9.
8 and 9. You'd think that the story was over. Story's not over, right? We have to figure out what happens to Victor, what happens to Lawrence and to Horace, what happens to the Sassoons, what happens to the Kaduris, because their story is not done. The Sassoons are still very wealthy, and the Kaduris are quite wealthy as well. I know that's late. All right,
Rabbi,
Yep.
realize that the Chinese gentleman who was in Austria was given a place of honor, righteous among the nations in Israel.
Yep.
After he had retired, or after he passed away, I guess.
Yes, posthumously. He was recognized by Yad Vashem.
And according to this, he issued 4,000 visas to Jews.
Well, that's what it says in the book. But if you look on the look up his name on the internet,
More than that.
they will say that it was 1,000. That by June of 1938, and he was there until May of 1940. But by June of 1938, he had issued 1,906 visas. So
those were official visas.
Those were official visas, right?
From what I understood, I forget whether he and his daughter appeared at the Temple Beth Jacob for an evening. And from what I understood, there were a lot more unofficial visas that he had just signed out.
And we're trying to call, we're not able to.
By the way, he was not the only one who did this. Devorah Wilhelm here in Portland, Devorah Wilhelm's family was saved by by another Japanese fellow who wrote visas as well to get Jews out.
That's who I may be confusing him with.
Yeah. Yeah, Judy? You're muted.
When I was in Sunday school at Avashalom, long, long ago, there was a girl in our class, Eva, I don't remember her last name, who I can't remember if it was Hong Kong or Shanghai. And at the time that just sounded so funny, but now it makes sense to me why she was there. Yeah, but so we went through religious school with her.
And what's interesting is,
You want to say?
I find interesting is the Jews, although they had friends, they made, none of them learned Chinese.
Yeah, right.
And I mention that only because when I was growing up in San Francisco, there was a man at the synagogue whose name was Horjelski, an unusual name. He learned Chinese in Hong Kong, in Shanghai, but that was very unusual. And I don't know why. You would think that the Jews there living among these Chinese would have learned Chinese.
I think it was interesting that they did all the business they did and never learned Chinese.
That's true. Much of the business was among themselves. Really. But they did have neighbors, they did have friends. Remember the numbers that we were given was 18,000 Jews in this ghetto area, but it wasn't just Jews. They were amidst 100,000 poor Chinese. Okay, we'll see everybody next week.
Yep.
Yep.
Take
Take
care.
care. We'll see you
Thank
next week.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I had a friend who was born in Shanghai, and his passport showed that he was born in Shanghai, and I used to kid him all the time, "You don't look Chinese."